I'm going to reveal to you today how you can make yourself into undeniably one of the world's greatest leaders. You'll become so convinced of this, you're going to wonder, why has no one ever laid this path out so clearly before? We need to start by clearly defining what we mean by leadership. There are a lot of lesser forms of leadership, but leadership at its highest level is the ability to take command and control of a situation to lead people to solve an irretractable problem or set of problems. Extraordinary leaders isolate the one or two key elements of a problem that have to change to break through. They isolate and mobilize key resources, not the least of which is human language, and send them into battle to make this shift. And finally, extraordinary leaders have the cognitive skills to persevere through the onslaught of resistance and constant stream of setbacks in pursuit of this breakthrough. This is where the mind the gap strategy comes in. In history, we see this level of leadership with people like Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. And in my book, Emotional Accountability, we see it with Washington, Lincoln, and Churchill. History is full of examples of them mobilizing the resources and the strategic messaging needed to advance civilization when we were at a crossroads. Some think you have to have a superhuman intellect to solve this magnitude of problems. This may seem obvious, but are they right? And I'm going to say, yes, they are. But before we count ourselves out, let's reframe the question. Did extraordinary leaders somehow develop an access to an intellect that is superhuman? And if so, might it be possible for each of us to develop this kind of access? And I'm going to go ahead and say yes to both of those questions. Yes, these extraordinary leaders forged access to a superhuman intellect. So what level of intellect does this look like? Can we see it? Can we touch it? To start to understand the superhuman intellect, imagine an infinite web that's like a fabric with contours running through space and time. The threads in this fabric connect with what you could think of as the world's electromagnetic DNA. The weave expands out into the cosmos and beyond. It runs backwards in time millions of years since life itself began and forward into time infinitum. This web connects and passes down the intellect of everything that has ever been in existence to you and me. We are nodes in a vast network. We're all connected, and we know this to be true. Just look at everything that travels electromagnetically through these airwaves. It's not hard to imagine that our own primordial intellect runs through this same grid. It is the front part of the brain that readily connects with this network. This is called the frontal cortex. It channels your consciousness and orchestrates all of the other subcomponents of your brain. Your intuition, things that you just know, and intellect flow through your frontal cortex. Are you visualizing your brain as part of this infinite web? Great. So next we'll expand that out just a bit. The frontal cortex's primary communication and thought articulation partner is the amygdala. We actually have a pair of these, with each one sitting right behind your temple, and they are about the same shape and size of an almond. While the frontal cortex is concerned with everything that is going on, the amygdala is hyper-focused on the next 10 seconds and the next 10 feet. The amygdala's job is to keep us alive right now. It's your instinctive and emotional center. Your amygdala decides how you should feel about things. Are we encountering a threat to our survival or not a threat? Have you expanded the imagery of the web that runs through the cosmos to connect your frontal cortex and then to your amygdala? Awesome. All day, every day, your frontal cortex and your amygdala are having a silent conversation. This conversation results in what you hear as a steady flow of your thoughts and decisions. You're not aware of these conversations because they happen silently and typically take place in milliseconds. At times, though, when the amygdala thinks the frontal cortex isn't responding fast enough or at all, it has the ability to take control of more of your thought process, even to the point of shutting out your frontal cortex altogether, but most of the time it's a mix. While the frontal cortex is wired to all of this vast intellect, the amygdala is wired to your adrenal and a few other glands that produce physical strength boosting chemicals like adrenaline and epinephrine. Because of this, the amygdala can make you pay a very high price for being ignored or misunderstood. But even worse than that, when this shift in thinking happens in response to some sort of perceived difficulty or threat, we go from being able to access all of the intellect in the cosmos to focusing more on the intellect needed to navigate the next 10 feet or the next 10 seconds. And our capability for truly brilliant, groundbreaking thought is diminished. We don't recognize this shift in our thinking, though, because we think we are just responding to what's in front of us. And right when we need to be at our peak intellectual performance to lead and solve seemingly irretractable problems, we're dumbing ourselves down and taking ourselves out of the game to be able to do just that. This tiny communications gap in your internal dialogue disconnects you from your primordial intellect. Learning to mind the gap is what will separate you from the world's most okayest leaders and the world's most extraordinary ones who are able to solve problems of an immense magnitude. Are you holding that image of your brain connected to this vast network through your frontal cortex with the connection to your amygdala? Great, that's pretty awesome. So now we'll come back to the question, why has no one ever laid this path out so clearly before? Is it because medical science hasn't advanced enough? Surely not. We just have to look at the world around us to understand the dramatic change that has happened in less than a generation and a half. And now you're likely asking, how do I find the communications gaps between my frontal cortex, my intuition center, and my amygdala, my instinctive center, so I can stop dumbing myself down and keep myself smarted up? Call to mind a challenging time you had where maybe things did not go so well for an extended period of time. Perhaps you were attempting to lead a process change to add some structure to the delivery of a training program to make outcomes more measurable. Believe it or not, this is one of the highest levels of leadership, leading a revolutionary change to establish a new order of things, to bring a little bit of structure, a little bit of discipline, to break an old pattern by establishing a new one. Now that thinking about this protracted situation is likely causing you to get a little upset, you are separating that internal dialogue and hearing what is coming from your amygdala. You are experiencing what it feels like when you shift your own thinking away from your higher thinking frontal cortex and the vast network of intellect. So stay with it. You're already doing the first step in terms of finding the gap. Listen to and take an account of your feelings when things are bothering you. You can think of it as keeping a disturbed feeling messy journal. Just write it out and blast it out there. It's pretty much cathartic journaling. Now you are over the target. What were the behaviors that you found so troubling? Was there an operational lack of cooperation and support that maybe even developed into bullying and manipulative behavior to keep you in your place? Some people can certainly maniacally dial in on your weaknesses. Primarily, when you're in your adolescent years, your amygdala records snapshots of experiences that make you feel unsafe, either dramatically at one time or repeated experiences over an extended time. Your frontal cortex is not online yet, so it doesn't have a copy of this, and that's likely by design. If lying is chasing us, we wouldn't want our frontal cortex taking 3 or 4 minutes to decide what to do about it. A key thing to keep top of mind is in today's world, these experiences did not need to be traumatic. For the remainder of your life, when your amygdala decides for you that you are in a similar situation, it's going to send alarms to your frontal cortex. Your frontal cortex may respond, but it's responding to what's happening now, driven by what happened long, long ago. So your amygdala is never really comfortable with how you proceed, and it hits the drugstore to keep you ratcheted up and cut off from the infinite web of intellect. It's like disconnecting your PC from the internet. It works, and you may not even be able to tell, but its capabilities are exponentially limited. The next step is to begin to bridge the gap. Ask yourself, I wonder what situations during my adolescence my amygdala thinks this is similar to. And it will come to you. What's inside has been waiting to be heard from for a long time. You may do all of this in one setting, or you may do it in several. But as you get things out of yourself and onto paper, you will now have 2 instances of yourself in which one can observe the other. eventually in a settled state, and start to look for patterns. So now imagine you're in your early teens and you're walking the halls of your middle school or high school. Think about your friends and adversaries. Some of them could be the same. You're now actually using your frontal cortex to explore what's inside of your amygdala. As your day progresses, imagine coming home and having dinner with the family. What's going on there? What kind of conversations and tensions? So now you have traveled back in time to when your amygdala was like a war correspondent, chronicling all of the anxiousness and awkwardness. So pick this back up by continuing to write therapeutically in your messy journal. Current study calls these ACEs, adverse childhood events, but that shows where the misalignment is. It implies that your childhood was not so good, and also most people don't equate people being an adolescent with being a child. You're really somewhere in between. The emotional accountability practices call these adolescent cognitive experiences because it is that time when the amygdala is coming on full force and the frontal cortex is not quite on the scene yet. Relabeling this makes it a lot easier to hold the frame, so to speak. So you certainly didn't have to have a terrible or traumatic upbringing to have ACEs. In fact, we all have them because our amygdalas don't know the difference between something that is truly terrible and something that is just awkward or very uncomfortable that is being intentionally inflicted upon us. Using this mind the gap filter, you can look for and locate within that storehouse your own ACEs. So are you still in the hallway in that corridor in junior high school starting out your day and also thinking about the dinner dynamics when you get home from school? Good. So now you can look for a couple of things. One, were there times when you were chronically ignored or disregarded? Maybe people at school or in your family played favorites, showed conditional love, wanted to keep you in your place, didn't provide much encouragement. Maybe you felt like you were never good enough. Maybe you were treated like you didn't matter and cast out or shunned when you were trying to fit in. A second source is being left alone or feeling like you were cut off, either like betrayed emotionally, financially, and different ways in which you felt like you were going to have to face the world alone. Then the third category is being treated severely or harshly, either by a parent or siblings, schoolmates. They showed a lot of discouragement, chronic negativism, insults. So keep writing. Now you have isolated the sources of the behaviors that form that gap. As you are using your frontal cortex to reveal these connections, you are scripting your frontal cortex to be able to hear the silent messages from your amygdala. They are no longer silent, they are heard, and the frontal cortex can say, I hear you, let's figure out what to do. But most importantly, your frontal cortex can tell your amygdala, there's no need to continue the biochemical storm or take over. I've got this. No need to dumb me down. Instead, let's smart me way up. Now that you have bridged the communications divide, you're ready for step 3, which is to rule the gap. You have to practice the mind the gap strategy daily because your dialogue will always be silent and you have to learn when and how to turn your attention to it to prevent your intellect from being compromised. But afterwards, you will have maintained command and control of all of your intellect. You will be able to see, connect, and reimagine the critical resources that others can't, that are needed to solve huge problems. With Mind the Gap, you now have a highly potent strategy to maintain access to all of the intellect that has ever existed in the world. You can confidently take command and control of a situation to lead people to solve irretractable problems. You will maintain access to the intellect needed to identify the 2 key elements that have to change to break through the problem. You will also be able to isolate and mobilize key resources, and as we mentioned earlier, not the least of which is the human language, to send them into battle to make the shift. And you will have the cognitive skills to persevere through the onslaught of resistance and constant stream of setbacks in pursuit of this breakthrough. Best of luck on your mission to become one of the world's greatest leaders.